Someone says something small, a shift in tone, a message that doesn't come back, a look that feels slightly different than before. And just like that, something inside you changes. Not all at once, but enough to feel it. Your attention narrows, your thoughts start circling. The moment stays with you longer than it should. You tell yourself it's nothing. You try to move on, but something has already taken hold. Your mind replays it, searching for meaning. Your mood begins to follow it, quietly adjusting around something that might not have even been intentional. And without realizing it, you've handed control of your inner state to something completely outside of you. Not because you chose to, but because it felt automatic, natural, almost unavoidable. And if you slow down for a moment, you'll start to notice something else. It isn't just this situation. It's a pattern, the same shift in different forms, repeating itself. Different people, different moments, same internal reaction. And over time, without being obvious, it begins to shape how you feel about yourself, based on things that were never fully yours to control in the first place. You might think the answer is simple, that you care too much, that you need thicker skin, that confidence is the missing piece. It sounds reasonable, almost comforting, because it suggests the problem is small and manageable. Just adjust your mindset, be a little tougher, stop taking things personally. But if that were true, it would already be fixed. You've tried to detach. You've told yourself not to care. You've replayed moments, trying to convince yourself they didn't matter. And yet, when it happens again, the reaction doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. Fast, automatic, familiar. That's the part most people overlook. If something keeps repeating despite your efforts to control it, then it's not surface level. It's structural. It's built into how you interpret what happens around you. Your emotional responses are not random. They follow patterns. And patterns like that don't come from nowhere. They come from systems you've been running for a long time, often without realizing it. When your emotional state rises and falls based on someone else's behavior, it reveals something important. Your center isn't where you think it is. It's not fully internal. It's external. It lives in reactions, in approval, in how others respond, in what is said or not said. And because of that, it keeps shifting. One moment you feel grounded, the next uncertain. Not because something inside you changed, but because something outside did. That's why it feels unstable. Because it is. You're trying to stand on something that moves. And no matter how carefully you balance yourself, the ground keeps shifting underneath you. Over time, this starts to feel normal, like this is just how life works. But what's actually happening isn't just natural emotional fluctuation. It's dependency. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but shows up in how easily your state is influenced by things you don't control. There's a difference between feeling something and being controlled by it. Feeling is temporary. It moves through you. Control changes how you think, how you act, how you see yourself. And when that control comes from something outside of you, it creates a kind of instability that follows you everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go or who you're with. The same pattern appears, just in different forms. This is where strength is often misunderstood. People think strength means shutting things down, becoming indifferent, not caring. But that doesn't solve anything. Suppression doesn't remove the reaction. It just hides it. And what's hidden builds pressure. It waits. And eventually it comes back stronger. So the goal isn't to feel less. It's to understand what your feelings are tied to. Because the real issue isn't that you feel too much. It's that your feelings are attached to things you don't control. And that attachment is what gives those things power over you. This is why two people can go through the same situation and come out with completely different reactions. One lets it pass. The other carries it for hours, maybe days. The difference isn't the situation, it's the interpretation. One is anchored internally, the other externally, and that distinction changes everything. There's a Stoic idea that cuts straight through this. If you are distressed by something external, the pain is not caused by the thing itself, but by your judgment of it. That's not just philosophy, it's a direct observation of how your mind works. The moment you really see that, something shifts, because it means the source of your instability isn't out there. It's in how you're relating to what's happening. And that realization is uncomfortable. It removes the ability to blame the world, but at the same time, it shows you where your control actually is. That's where the shift begins, not in trying to control everything outside of you, which is impossible, but in understanding what's happening inside of you, in noticing how quickly your mind assigns meaning, how it turns small moments into something personal, how it creates conclusions that feel real, even when they're based on incomplete information. And instead of following those interpretations automatically, you begin to question them. Not forcefully, not perfectly, just enough to create a small distance between what happens and how you react. And in that distance, something changes. You're no longer fully inside the reaction. You're also observing it, and that observation weakens its grip. Over time, that small distance grows. You start to catch reactions earlier. You start to see patterns more clearly. You begin to recognize when your state is being pulled by something external, and instead of being carried by it, you pause, even briefly. And that pause gives you a choice, not a perfect one, not always a strong one, but a real one. You can either follow the reaction or step back from it, and every time you step back, even slightly, you take something back that you've been giving away without realizing it. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And that's how stability is built. Not by controlling the world, but by understanding how you relate to it. If this way of seeing things feels different, don't let it pass too quickly. Stay with it. Let it challenge how you've been interpreting your own reactions. And if you want to keep going deeper into this, if you want to build that kind of clarity consistently, then subscribing is a decision to keep looking at your own mind a little more honestly. The Stoics understood something that still feels uncomfortable when you really sit with it. Not because it's complicated, but because it's simple in a way that leaves no room for excuses. There are things that belong to you and things that do not. Your thoughts, your choices, the way you interpret what happens, those are yours. But everything else, especially how other people act, respond, or perceive you, exists completely outside that boundary. And yet, if you pay attention to your daily reactions, you'll notice how often that line gets blurred without you realizing it. You respond to someone's tone as if it carries authority over your worth. You absorb someone's silence as if it means something definitive about you. You take a reaction, something momentary and external, and treat it as if it's a stable truth. It doesn't feel like you're doing anything unusual when it happens. It feels natural, almost automatic. That's what makes it so easy to miss. The mind moves quickly, assigning meaning before you even have time to question it. A delayed response becomes disinterest. A short reply becomes rejection. A lack of enthusiasm becomes judgment. And once that meaning is assigned, your emotional state follows it immediately. Not because the situation demanded it, but because your interpretation shaped it. This is where the real shift begins, because the problem isn't just what's happening around you, it's how easily you convert external events into internal conclusions. There's a quiet assumption underneath all of this that rarely gets examined. The assumption that other people's reactions are reliable indicators of your value, that if someone approves of you, it confirms something real. And if they don't, it exposes something lacking. But when you rely on something unstable to define something that should be stable, you create a system that can never fully hold. Because other people are not consistent. Their moods change, their attention shifts, their priorities move. And none of that has anything to do with you, even though it often feels like it does. This is where the Stoic distinction becomes more than just an idea. It becomes a line you either respect or ignore. Some things are up to us and some are not. And the more you observe your own reactions, the more you start to see how often you step outside of what is yours and try to manage what isn't. You try to predict how others will respond. You adjust your behavior to influence their perception. You monitor their reactions to stabilize your own state. And in doing so, you slowly build a system where your internal balance depends on something external staying consistent. But the external world doesn't operate that way. It was never designed to. That's why the instability keeps returning. Not because you're doing something wrong in the moment, but because the structure itself is unstable. You've tied your sense of self to variables that change constantly, and when those variables shift, even slightly, your internal state shifts with them. It's not dramatic at first. Sometimes it's subtle, a small drop in mood, a slight sense of unease. But over time, those small shifts accumulate into a pattern that feels like unpredictability. Like you're fine one moment and unsettled the next, without a clear reason. This is why the Stoic perspective isn't about detachment in the way it's often misunderstood. It's not about ignoring people or becoming indifferent. It's about placing things in their correct position, recognizing what belongs to you and what doesn't, and refusing to mix the two. Because the moment you stop treating external reactions as internal truths, something begins to stabilize. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually. You start to notice the gap between what happens and what you make it mean. You start to see how quickly your mind fills in interpretations that feel real but aren't necessarily accurate. And instead of following those interpretations automatically, you begin to pause, even briefly. And that pause changes the entire dynamic. Because now the reaction is no longer immediate, it's observed. And once something is observed, it can be questioned. Not suppressed, not denied, but examined. You begin to ask whether the meaning you've assigned is actually justified or just familiar. Whether the reaction you're having is based on reality or on a pattern you've repeated so many times, it feels like truth. And in that process, something starts to shift. Not in the external world. People still behave unpredictably. Situations still change. But internally, the dependency begins to loosen. Because you're no longer handing over authority automatically. You're no longer treating every external signal as something that defines you. You begin to reclaim that boundary, slowly but consistently. And as that boundary becomes clearer, so does your sense of stability. Not because nothing affects you anymore, but because what affects you no longer has the same level of control. The reaction still exists, but it doesn't take over in the same way. It doesn't define the moment completely. It passes through instead of settling in. That's the difference between understanding this idea and actually living it. One is intellectual, the other is practiced. And the more you practice it, the more you realize that stability was never about controlling the world around you. It was about understanding what was never yours to control in the first place, and finally letting it go. There's a pattern hidden inside your reactions that doesn't become obvious until you slow down enough to notice it. Not everything affects you equally. Some comments pass through without leaving a trace, while others stay with you long after the moment is gone. One person's opinion feels irrelevant, almost weightless. Another's feels heavy, almost defining. And if you look closely, that difference isn't random. It's precise. It follows a logic that isn't immediately visible, but it's there, shaping what stays and what fades. The reaction itself is the clue. Not just that it happened, but how strongly it happened, how long it lasted, and how much space it took up in your mind afterward. It's easy to assume that the intensity comes from the situation itself, that something about what was said or done was objectively more significant. But when you compare different moments honestly, that explanation starts to break down. The same type of comment can affect you differently depending on who says it. The same behavior can feel harmless in one context and deeply unsettling in another. which suggests that the source of the reaction isn't only external, it's connected to something internal, something already there before the moment even happened. That's where things start to become more revealing. Because when a reaction feels disproportionate to the situation, it usually means the situation touched something that was already sensitive. Not created it, but activated it. And what gets activated isn't random either. It tends to be something unresolved, something not fully understood or accepted. A part of yourself that hasn't been integrated, so it reacts strongly when it shows up in the external world. This is why certain people seem to have a kind of influence that goes beyond logic. It's not about their authority, their status, or even their intention. It's about what they represent to you, often without either of you realizing it. They reflect something back, and that reflection doesn't feel neutral. It feels charged, almost personal, and that charge is what drives the intensity of your response. Carl Jung pointed to this with a level of clarity that still feels unsettling. He observed that what you resist in others often exists in some form within you, even if you don't consciously recognize it. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That idea shifts the focus completely. Instead of looking outward for the cause of your reaction, it turns your attention inward, toward what the reaction is revealing. But pushing something aside doesn't remove it. It just moves it out of conscious awareness, and from there, it finds other ways to appear, often through projection, through seeing those same traits in others and reacting to them as if they're completely separate from you. That's why the reaction feels so strong. Because it's not just about what you're seeing, it's about what you're seeing reflected back. This is where the sense of threat comes in. Not a physical threat, but a psychological one. Because when something you've rejected internally shows up externally, it challenges the image you've built of yourself. It disrupts the way you prefer to see yourself. And that disruption creates discomfort. The reaction that follows is often an attempt to push that discomfort away, to re-establish the sense of control. But reacting in that way doesn't resolve anything. It reinforces the pattern. It keeps the focus on the external, on the other person, on what they did or didn't do. And as long as the focus stays there, the underlying issue remains unexamined, which means it continues to influence your reactions, often without you realizing it. There's a different approach, but it requires a shift in how you relate to your own responses. Instead of immediately judging the reaction or trying to suppress it, you start to look at it more closely. Not in a critical way, but in a curious one. You notice what specifically triggered the response. You pay attention to the intensity. You observe how it unfolds. And gradually, patterns begin to emerge. You start to see that the same types of situations trigger similar reactions. That certain traits consistently stand out to you. That certain dynamics repeat themselves across different relationships. And once you see those patterns, you can't really ignore them anymore. They start to reveal something about how you've been relating to yourself, not just to others. This doesn't mean every reaction is a deep psychological signal that needs to be analyzed. Sometimes a reaction is just a reaction. But when the intensity is high, when it lingers, when it affects your sense of self, it's worth paying attention. Because that's where the deeper information is. And as you begin to understand those patterns, something shifts. The reaction doesn't disappear immediately, but it becomes less overwhelming. It loses some of its automatic control, because now, instead of being completely absorbed in it, you're also observing it. There's a small distance between you and the reaction. And in that distance, there's space. Space to question what you're feeling. Space to consider where it's coming from. Space to respond differently. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to start changing the pattern. And over time, that small shift in awareness begins to change how much power those moments actually have over you. At a certain point, the pattern becomes too consistent to ignore. The same types of traits keep triggering the same kinds of reactions, even when the people and situations change. It's no longer convincing to say it's just coincidence or bad luck with others. There's something more structured underneath it, something that repeats with enough precision that it starts to feel intentional. Not intentional in the sense that you choose it, but in the sense that it follows a design. And once you begin to notice that design, the idea of projection stops being abstract and starts becoming something you can actually observe in your own life. It shows up in the details, the way a certain kind of arrogance immediately gets under your skin, not just as a mild irritation, but as something sharper, something that lingers. The way someone else's neediness creates a reaction that feels stronger than the situation seems to justify. The way certain behaviors feel almost personal, even when they're not directed at you in any direct way. These reactions don't come out of nowhere. They're tied to something internal, something that has its own history, even if you're not fully aware of it. Because the truth is, the traits that disturb you the most are often the ones you've had to negotiate within yourself. Not necessarily traits you openly express, but ones you've learned to suppress, reshape, or deny. Maybe confidence was once seen as arrogance, so you learned to hold yourself back. Maybe needing support was seen as weakness, so you trained yourself to appear independent. Over time, those adjustments become part of how you operate. They shape your behavior, your self-image, and the way you relate to others. But the original impulses don't disappear. They're still there, just pushed out of sight. And what happens to something that is pushed out of awareness but never resolved? It finds another way to exist. It doesn't vanish. It relocates. Often it shows up externally, through other people. You start noticing those same traits in others, and because you've created distance between yourself and those traits internally, they feel foreign when you see them outside, but at the same time, they feel familiar in a way that's hard to explain. That combination, familiarity and rejection, is what gives the reaction its intensity. Carl Jung described this dynamic in a way that cuts straight through the surface. He noted that what remains unconscious doesn't stay inactive. It continues to influence perception and behavior from the background. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That idea carries a weight that becomes clearer the more you observe your own patterns. Because when something keeps repeating in your reactions, it starts to feel like it's just the way things are. Like certain people just affect you more, like certain situations are just more difficult. But when you trace it back, you begin to see that it's not just about the external, it's about something internal that hasn't been fully seen. This is where the meaning of your reactions begins to shift. Instead of treating them as direct responses to what's happening outside, you start to see them as reflections. Not perfect reflections, not always obvious, but reflections nonetheless. Each strong reaction carries information. It points to something within you that is still active, still influencing how you interpret the world. And if you ignore that signal, if you continue to focus only on the external trigger, the pattern continues. There's a certain resistance that comes with this realization. It's uncomfortable to consider that the things you dislike most in others might have a connection to something within you. It challenges the clarity of your judgments. It blurs the line between what is purely external and what is internally influenced. But that discomfort is also where the potential for understanding begins. Because once you allow yourself to consider that possibility, your reactions stop being something that just happens to you. They become something you can learn from. This doesn't mean that every reaction is a projection or that every trait you notice in others exists in you in the same way. The point is not to collapse all distinctions, but to recognize patterns where they exist, especially when the reaction is strong, persistent, and disproportionate. That's usually where the deeper information is. That's where something within you is being activated, not created, but brought into awareness through the interaction. When you start paying attention to this, something subtle begins to change. The reaction still comes, but it's no longer completely automatic. There's a moment, even if it's brief, where you notice it. You recognize the intensity. And instead of immediately directing your attention outward, you begin to turn some of that attention inward. Not in a self-critical way, but in a curious one. You begin to ask what exactly is being triggered and why. That shift in attention changes the entire dynamic, because now, instead of being fully absorbed in the reaction, you're also observing it. And that observation creates space. Not a large space at first, but enough to interrupt the automatic pattern, enough to see that the reaction is not just about the present moment. It's connected to something that has been there for a while, shaping how you respond long before this specific situation occurred. And as that awareness grows, the reactions start to lose some of their force. Not because you're suppressing them, but because you're understanding them. You're no longer treating the external trigger as the sole cause. You're recognizing the internal component, the part of the reaction that comes from your own unresolved relationship with certain traits or experiences. And once you see that, it becomes harder to be completely controlled by it. This is where the idea of control begins to shift as well. It's no longer about trying to prevent reactions or eliminate certain feelings. It's about changing your relationship to them, seeing them clearly, understanding where they come from, and deciding how much authority they actually have. Because when you stop treating reflections as causes, you begin to take back something that was never meant to be given away in the first place. And over time, that changes not just how you react, but how you see the people around you. They stop being triggers in the same way, not because they've changed, but because your interpretation of what they represent has. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, is where a different kind of stability begins to take shape. There's another layer to this that feels different, almost deceptive in how convincing it is. It doesn't show up as irritation or discomfort. It shows up as relief, as grounding, as something that feels like completion. You meet someone or connect with someone in a certain way, and suddenly things feel easier, clearer, more stable. Their presence seems to organize something inside you that previously felt scattered. Their attention feels meaningful in a way that goes beyond surface-level validation. It feels like recognition, like something in you is finally being seen and confirmed, and because it feels positive, it rarely gets questioned. But if you stay with that feeling long enough, something else becomes noticeable. The stability it creates isn't entirely yours. It depends on their presence, their attention, their consistency. When they're there, you feel grounded. When they pull back, even slightly, something shifts again. The same sense of stability that felt so solid begins to weaken, not all at once, but enough to feel it. And the more you rely on that external source to maintain that feeling, the more sensitive you become to any change in it. This is where the pattern starts to reveal itself more clearly, because what feels like connection is often mixed with dependency, not dependency in an obvious or extreme way, but in a subtle, psychological sense. You begin to place part of your internal balance in someone else's hands, not consciously, not intentionally, but gradually, through repeated interactions, through the way their responses affect you, through the meaning you attach to their presence. And over time, that connection becomes something you rely on to feel a certain way about yourself. That's why the loss of that connection doesn't feel like a simple change. It feels disproportionate. It feels like something larger has been taken away. Because in a sense, it has. Not just the person, but the part of yourself that you were experiencing through them. The version of yourself that felt more complete, more stable, more certain. And when that disappears, it creates a gap, a kind of internal absence that feels difficult to explain. Carl Jung approached this in a way that shifts the entire perspective. He suggested that what we often see in others, especially the qualities we deeply admire or feel drawn to, are not just attributes of that person. They are also reflections of potential within ourselves that we haven't fully developed. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That idea carries a different kind of implication when you apply it here, because it suggests that what you feel in the presence of someone else is not something they are giving you, it's something they are helping you access. But if you haven't built that internally, if you haven't developed those qualities within yourself, then the experience remains external. It depends on them, which means it can be removed. And when it is, the absence feels like a loss of something essential, even though it was never fully yours to begin with. This is why the emotional reaction to someone pulling away can feel so intense. It's not just about missing them, it's about losing access to a certain state of being that you had come to associate with them, a state that felt like clarity, confidence, or completeness. And without them, that state feels out of reach again, not because it doesn't exist, but because the pathway you were using to access it was external. You're no longer unconsciously placing your sense of wholeness in someone else. You're recognizing that what feels like completion is actually a reflection of something you're capable of developing within yourself. And that realization begins to shift the dependency. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to change how you relate to the connection. You can still appreciate it, still value it, still feel the impact it has, but it no longer holds the same level of control, because your sense of self is no longer fully tied to it. You begin to build that sense of stability from within, gradually, through your own actions, your own understanding, your own way of relating to yourself. And as that internal foundation strengthens, the external connections start to feel different as well. Not less meaningful, but less necessary for your sense of balance. You're no longer looking to them to complete something. You're engaging with them from a place that is already more whole. That shift changes everything. Because now, when something external changes, it doesn't create the same level of collapse. The connection can shift, evolve, or even end. And while it may still affect you, it doesn't take something essential away. Because what felt essential was never meant to be held outside of you in the first place. And in recognizing that, you begin to take back something that was quietly placed elsewhere. Not by force, not by detachment, but through understanding. And that understanding becomes the beginning of a more stable way of being, one that isn't constantly dependent on whether or not someone else stays the same. At this point, the pattern starts to come together in a way that's difficult to ignore. On one side, there are the traits you reject, the parts of yourself you've pushed away, showing up in others and triggering strong reactions. On the other side, there are the qualities you feel drawn to, the ones you haven't fully developed, appearing in others and creating a sense of admiration or even dependence. In both directions, something internal is being placed outside of you, and once it's outside, it becomes something you no longer control. That's the common thread. Whether it shows up as irritation or admiration, the result is the same. Your internal state begins to depend on something external, but even this doesn't reach the deepest layer of what's happening. Because there are moments when no one is directly triggering you, no one is challenging you, no one is validating you, and yet there is still a pressure present, a quiet tension that sits in the background, a sense that you need to maintain something, not for a specific person, but for the world in general, a version of yourself that you've built over time, one that feels acceptable, competent, composed, the version of you that seems to function well in different environments. That version doesn't appear suddenly. It's developed gradually, shaped by what has been rewarded and what has been discouraged. Certain behaviors led to approval, so they were reinforced. Others led to discomfort or rejection, so they were adjusted or removed. Over time, this process creates a kind of internal blueprint for how you should present yourself. And because it works, because it leads to smoother interactions and more predictable outcomes, you begin to rely on it. Not just as a strategy, but as an identity. At first it feels natural. You don't question it. It's just who you are, or at least who you believe yourself to be. But the more closely you identify with that version, the more dependent you become on maintaining it. Because now, it's not just a way of interacting with the world, it's the foundation of how you see yourself. And anything that threatens it doesn't feel like a minor disruption. It feels personal. This is where the fragility begins to show. Not because the version itself is weak, but because of how tightly it's held. When your identity depends on maintaining a certain image, every interaction becomes a kind of test. Every comment, every reaction from others carries potential significance, not necessarily because it is significant, but because of what it might imply about you. And that creates a constant background tension, a need to monitor, adjust, and protect. Seneca captured something essential about this kind of pressure when he wrote that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. That line becomes clearer when you look at how much of this tension is driven not by actual threats, but by anticipated ones, by the possibility that something might disrupt the image you've built. And so you begin to operate with a kind of caution, not always consciously, but consistently. You choose your words carefully. You adjust your tone. You read situations before acting, all of it aimed at preserving that version of yourself. But the more you invest in maintaining that image, the more exposed you become to anything that might challenge it. Because now your sense of stability is tied to something that exists partly in the perception of others. And just like before, anything that depends on external perception is inherently unstable. It can change without warning. It can shift based on factors that have nothing to do with you, and when it does, it affects how you see yourself. This creates a subtle but persistent cycle. You maintain the image to feel stable, but maintaining it makes you more sensitive to anything that might threaten it, which in turn makes you more reactive, more attentive to external signals, more dependent on how you're perceived, and the cycle continues, reinforcing itself over time. There's also a deeper cost that doesn't always surface immediately. When you spend so much energy maintaining a specific version of yourself, you begin to lose connection with the parts that don't fit that image. The parts that were set aside because they didn't align with what was expected or accepted. And over time, that creates a kind of internal distance. A sense that there's more to you than what is being expressed, but no clear access to it. As that understanding deepens, the need to constantly maintain that image begins to loosen. You still function, you still engage, but there's less pressure to be consistent in a rigid way, less need to protect every aspect of how you're perceived. And that creates space. Space to respond more naturally, space to allow different parts of yourself to exist without immediately filtering them. And in that space, something begins to stabilize. Not because you've perfected your image, but because your sense of self is no longer entirely dependent on it. It's grounded in something less conditional, something that doesn't require constant reinforcement from the outside. That shift doesn't remove all reactions. It doesn't make you unaffected by what happens around you, but it changes the degree to which those reactions define you. It reduces the extent to which external perception determines your internal state. And that, over time, changes how much control the outside world actually has over you. The Stoics approach this entire problem from a completely different angle, one that doesn't try to control the world, but instead focuses on understanding the mind that reacts to it. Not in theory, but in practice, because knowing that you shouldn't be controlled by external things is one thing. Living in a way where that actually happens is something else entirely, and that gap between understanding and application is where most people get stuck. It's where reactions still feel automatic, still feel justified, still feel like they leave no room for anything else. Marcus Aurelius kept returning to the same idea in his writings, not as something abstract or philosophical, but as something immediate and practical, a reminder to come back to yourself, to your own mind, especially in moments where it feels like everything is being pulled outward. Because when something happens, your attention moves quickly. It goes straight to the event, the person, the situation. It locks onto what was said, what was done, how it felt. And in that movement, something subtle gets missed. What gets missed is the part where interpretation begins. The moment where the event is no longer just an event, but something that carries meaning. That meaning feels automatic, almost inseparable from what happened. But it isn't. It's created, quietly, quickly, and often without being questioned. And once that meaning is in place, your reaction follows it almost instantly, not because it has to, but because it feels like the only possible response. This is where the idea of space becomes important. Not physical space, but psychological space. The space between what happens and how you respond to it. It's easy to talk about this space as if it's always there, always accessible. But in reality, it's often so small that it feels like it doesn't exist at all, especially when the reaction is strong. When something hits a sensitive point, the response can feel immediate, almost reflexive. And in those moments, it doesn't feel like there's any gap to step into. But reaching that point consistently requires practice, not dramatic effort, but repeated attention, because your mind is used to reacting quickly. It's used to forming interpretations instantly and treating them as truth. And changing that pattern doesn't happen by simply deciding to think differently. It happens by slowing down just enough to see what's happening before it fully takes over. That slowing down doesn't mean hesitation or passivity. It means clarity. It means allowing yourself a moment to recognize that what you're experiencing is not just the event, but your interpretation of it. And once you see that distinction, even briefly, you create the possibility of responding differently. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to begin shifting the pattern. There's also an important difference between observing a reaction and trying to suppress it. Suppression pushes the reaction down, but doesn't change its source. It stays there, waiting for another opportunity to surface. Observation, on the other hand, brings the reaction into awareness. It allows you to see it as something that is happening, rather than something that completely defines the moment. And that distinction reduces its intensity over time. As this becomes more familiar, something else starts to change. The urgency of your reactions begins to decrease, not because things stop affecting you, but because the immediate need to respond starts to soften. You begin to see that not every thought needs to be followed, not every feeling needs to dictate your behavior. There is space, even if it's small, to choose how you engage with what's happening. And in that space, control begins to take on a different meaning. It's no longer about managing external outcomes or ensuring that everything goes the way you want. It's about understanding your own mind well enough to not be carried away by it automatically. It's about recognizing when you're assigning meaning too quickly, when you're reacting based on patterns rather than the present moment. This doesn't remove difficulty from your life. Situations still arise. People still behave unpredictably. Emotions still come and go. But your relationship to those things changes. They no longer have the same level of authority over you, because you're no longer treating your immediate reaction as the final truth. You're seeing it as the first layer, not the whole picture. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, creates a different kind of stability. One that doesn't depend on the world behaving in a certain way. One that isn't constantly disrupted by small changes in external conditions. It's built on something internal, something that develops through awareness and practice, rather than control over circumstances. Over time, this way of approaching your reactions becomes more natural. The space becomes easier to access. The interpretations become easier to question. And the reactions, while still present, become less overwhelming. Not because they've disappeared, but because they no longer take over in the same way. That's where the real change begins to take shape, not in eliminating what you feel, but in understanding it clearly enough that it no longer controls you. And this is where everything begins to settle into place, not as a final answer, but as a direction that becomes clearer the more you follow it. Because being emotionally unshakable is often misunderstood. It's not about becoming cold, distant, or unaffected. It's not about eliminating emotion or pretending that things don't matter. That idea sounds appealing at first, but it misses the point entirely. What actually changes is not whether you feel, but how much authority those feelings have over you. The difference is subtle, but it transforms everything. The core of it comes down to something simple, but difficult to practice. Where is your center? Not where you think it is, not where you want it to be, but where it actually operates from in real time. Because every time your state shifts based on something external, it reveals that your center has moved. It has been placed somewhere outside of you, even if only for a moment, and that movement happens quietly, often without being noticed, because it feels natural. It feels like a normal reaction. But over time, those small shifts accumulate into a pattern that shapes how you experience yourself. Taking that center back is not a single decision. It's not something that happens once and stays that way. It's a repeated process. You notice the shift, you recognize where your attention has gone, and you bring it back. Not forcefully, not with frustration, but with clarity. You see that your reaction is tied to something external, and instead of following it automatically, you pause, even briefly, and in that pause, you create a different outcome. Not in a way that denies your feelings, but in a way that separates the feeling from the conclusion. You allow the reaction to exist without immediately turning it into a statement about your worth or your identity. That separation is small, but it's powerful, because it prevents the reaction from expanding into something larger than it needs to be. Over time, this becomes more natural. The pause becomes easier to access. The awareness becomes more immediate, and the reactions, while still present, lose some of their intensity, not because you've suppressed them, but because you've stopped feeding them with automatic interpretations. You've stopped turning every external signal into something that defines you. This doesn't mean you become unaffected by what happens around you. You still feel things. You still experience moments of discomfort, frustration, or disappointment. But those experiences no longer have the same level of control. They don't dictate your entire state. They pass through instead of taking over. There's also a shift in how you relate to other people. Their behavior still matters, but it no longer determines your internal stability in the same way. You can appreciate positive interactions without becoming dependent on them. You can experience negative interactions without collapsing into them, because your sense of self is no longer tied as tightly to those external responses. And this is where a different kind of stability begins to form. Not one that depends on consistency in the external world, but one that comes from understanding your own mind, from recognizing patterns, questioning interpretations, and choosing how much authority you give to what happens around you. It's quieter than the kind of stability most people look for, less dramatic, but more reliable. The process itself is gradual. There are moments where the old patterns return, where reactions happen quickly, where awareness comes too late. That's part of it. The goal is not perfection, it's direction. Each time you notice the pattern, each time you create even a small pause, each time you question an automatic interpretation, you shift the pattern slightly. And those small shifts add up. They change how often you react automatically. They change how long those reactions last. They change how much influence external events have over your internal state. Not all at once, but over time, in a way that becomes noticeable if you pay attention. Eventually, something becomes clear. The stability you were looking for was never going to come from controlling the external world. It was always going to come from understanding how you relate to it, from recognizing where your center is and bringing it back when it moves. And once that becomes part of how you operate, the world doesn't need to change for you to feel different, because the control you were looking for was never out there. It was always in how you chose to respond to what happens moment by moment. There will always be noise. People will change. Situations will shift. But the moment you stop letting those things decide who you are, something quiet and powerful takes its place. A kind of stability that doesn't break every time the world moves. And once you feel even a glimpse of that, you won't want to go back. If something here stayed with you, don't let it fade into another passing thought. Go deeper. There's a video on your screen that will help you continue this shift. Watch it while this perspective is still fresh. And thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.